Rivalries. They're a staple of American life, from Pepsi and Coke to Texas and California. America is built off competition, and competition breeds rivalries. They get us excited, keep us hooked, and create strange subcultures for arguably very niche markets. I mean, come on, it's objectively insane that we have people committing acts of domestic terrorism over what sports team they like. Just imagine trying to explain this to a European. But there's one set of rivalries that has always interested me: city rivalries. When we think of rivalries between cities today, what usually comes to mind are the heavy hitters like New York and Boston, or Los Angeles and San Francisco. Nowadays, rivalries like these are usually understood in the context of sports, leading some people to mistakenly think that the sport is what created the rivalry, when in reality, it's the other way around. The rivalries between our cities date back to their foundings, especially out west. As the frontier developed, communities banded together near something of economic value, like a river, or a mine, or a fertile valley. Of course, if a spot was popular enough, someone was destined to set up shop next door. With settlers now given the option of where to go, cities started competing with each other for the most valuable resource around: people. But this could only go on for so long before one side gave up, submitting themselves to the victor. Ever wonder why we're talking about Los Angeles instead of Santa Monica, or Houston instead of Galveston, even though Santa Monica and Galveston are the older cities? It's because at some point, Los Angeles and Houston won that competition. Cities far enough away from each other, like Chicago and Detroit, continued to challenge each other for regional supremacy. But for every Phoenix, there was 100 Mesas. This isn't to say that cities like Georgetown or Boulder aren't great, but this is simply talking about how, in the competition for attracting population and status to become one of the country's largest cities, the laws of nature demanded that one would rise and one would fall. Of America's largest 25 cities, none are within 45 miles of another. That is, except for one pairing, the only one to defy the laws of metro development altogether. The only one to grow up on top of each other without either one killing the other, no matter how many times either side tried. The 9th and 12th largest cities in the country: Dallas and Fort Worth. And this is the history of that rivalry. Be sure to stick around until the end of the video for my point-for-point comparison and find out which one comes out on top. Now let's get to it. It's the 1830s, and Texas just won its independence from Mexico. Suck it, imperialists. Today, the state of Texas is larger than every European country outside of Russia. But at the time of the Republic, it was even bigger. The Lone Star stretched from Louisiana to the Rio Grande, and all the way up to modern Wyoming. But hardly anyone actually lived there, at least hardly any white settlers. The area was still heavily populated with native tribes, mostly nomadic like the Wichita, Kiowa, and the dreaded Comanche. The general rule of thumb was that the further north and west you got from the coast, the more hostile it was. This led to almost all Texan settlement being in the east and the south in cities like Victoria, San Antonio, and the largest city, the Manhattan of the Gulf, Galveston.
Disappointed in New Orleans. Where they going, Chuck?
Galveston. That dirty ass water. We're not even gonna send them to Cancun. We're gonna send them to Galveston with that dirty ass water be washed up on the shore. You people think they're in the beach.
But this didn't stop the Texan population from booming. Political recognition established relationships with countries around the world, leading to diplomats from the United States, France, and the British Empire establishing embassies in each other's capitals. Fun fact, if you've ever seen the Kingsman movies, you've seen the old Texan embassy in London, as the former embassy is what was used for the actual Kingsman tailor shop. It actually has a Texan historical marker outside. Anyway, within 4 years of independence, the Texan population was exploding, and this was long before the discovery of oil and gas, so the state's largest economic draw was land, leading folks to venturing further north and west in search of wide-open, free acreage. Enter John Neely Bryan, a farmer, lawyer, and trader. In 1839, Bryan surveyed a fork in the Trinity River, far enough north to serve as a trading post between the natives and settlers. He staked his claim and created his outpost. Only a couple years later, it had grown enough to where Bryan switched his plan from being a simple trading post to becoming a permanent settlement. But there was one problem. Nearby was another, already established community called Bird's Fort, in what is today Arlington. Bryan knew that his town wouldn't be able to grow with this settlement right next door. So, in a perfect example of city competition at work, he convinced the Bird settlement to abandon their homes and move into his new city. Thus, in 1841, the city of Dallas was born. There's still debate over why Dallas was picked as the name. For a long time, the assumption was that it was named after the then up-and-coming Vice President of the United States, George M. Dallas. But this doesn't make much sense, as Dallas was the former mayor of Philadelphia and had no connection to Texas whatsoever. Other theories include that it was actually named after George Dallas's brother, Alexander James Dallas, who was a U.S. Commodore in the Gulf, that it was named from a city naming contest hosted by locals in 1842, or that it was picked because of its Scottish roots, which means Valley of Water. Bryan himself claimed that he named it after a friend, but no records of any acquaintance with someone named Dallas exist, so it'll remain a mystery. What isn't a mystery is the city's success in those vital first years of settlement. One of the most valuable things for a developing community is the existence of some local industry, but relying on a single industry can put a town in a precarious situation. Just look at the old steel belt towns whenever all the business moved out. But what's one industry that can't up and move? Government. So one of the most valuable things a burgeoning town could get was to be designated as the seat of the county's government, meaning that local administration, bureaucracy, and courts would all be centered there. In less than 10 years, Dallas won this fight, officially getting the county seat moved to it by 1850, and even rendering the county's name itself to become Dallas. But just one county west, something else was underway. After the annexation of Texas into the Union following a decade of independence and the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, the United States gained a massive amount of land west of the Rio Grande. To help facilitate travel to the new western territories and combat the feared Cherokee, the U.S. Army established a line of forts up from Mexico to the Red River, officially drawing a line in the sand as the start of the Wild West. The furthest north of these forts, and thus the most isolated, was named after Mexican-American war hero and commander of the Department of Texas, General William Jenkins Worth. In 1849, the Army established a base between the Clear Fork and West Fork of the Trinity River, effectively acting as a moat. In the first year, flooding from the river, which would prove to be a recurring issue for the city, destroyed the encampment, causing them to move up to higher ground, where the modern Fort Worth Courthouse sits today. The Army remained until 1853, leaving the buildings to be claimed by the civilian population. Just as Dallas had before, Fort Worthers knew the importance of being the seat of the local government, and successfully took the crown from neighboring Birdville in 1856. Unlike Dallas, Fort Worth did not change their county's name, instead choosing to honor the hero of the Texan Revolution, General Edward H. Tarrant, by leaving the county's name, Tarrant, intact. Despite being so close to each other, Dallas and Fort Worth were wildly different. As an original trading post, Dallas naturally developed into a center for commerce, which led into banking and then tech. Fort Worth, on the other hand, started as a rugged military outpost to protect local ranchers, leading Fort Worth down a more agricultural path that we can still see today. Fort Worth Stock Show and Rodeo were the oldest continuously running stock show and rodeo, thus being one of the oldest sporting events in the country, dating all the way back to 1896. Fort Worth also has a vibrant youth agriculture scene, with numerous 4-H and FFA chapters that annually compete in the county stock show. Dallas, on the other hand, has done their best to distance themselves from its frontier roots, with agricultural programs like 4-H and FFA practically non-existent, especially since Dallas has no county show. After the end of the Civil War, the Texan population climbed again with immigration from the war-torn East. Especially in the era of Reconstruction, folks were eager to flee from the harsh conditions of the heavily populated East for the rural and untamed West. This led to the start of an era that not only defined Texas, but American culture as a whole, the Wild West. With Texas having been so far removed from much of the fighting during the Civil War, much of the state had already been experiencing what would later define the Wild West, with long cattle drives, sprawling ranches, and battles between morally gray lawmen and bandits. A few years after the war, with the Texan cattle market opened back to the rest of the country, Joseph G. McCoy built the stockyards in Abilene, Kansas, where herds could be loaded onto trains bound for the slaughterhouses in Chicago. Suddenly, Texan beef was being driven up from across the state, passing through the new route now called the Chisholm Trail. As the first major stop before leaving the state for their over 400-mile journey north to Abilene, Fort Worth developed into a cattle mecca. This led to one of Fort Worth's first nicknames, Cowtown. Supplies were purchased and new hands were hired, typically spending their entire pay for the season in one of the city's many saloons or brothels. The city designated a section of the downtown as a red light district in the 1870s, and it quickly gained the moniker Hell's Half Acre and the, quote, Bloody Third Ward. Nearly every famous Wild West celebrity ventured through the acre, including Doc Holliday, Wyatt Earp, Butch Cassidy, and of course, Harry Alonzo Lagabaugh, better known as the Sundance Kid. As Fort Worth was gaining a reputation for shootouts and sin, Dallas invested further into eastern industries like manufacturing and farming. I know I just said farming, so for any of you city slickers out there that are confused, this is ranching, this is farming. As Fort Worthers created ranches and raised cattle, Dallasides focused on smaller farms, raising cash crops like cotton. While folks ventured into Fort Worth on their last stop before venturing north up to Kansas or west to settle the territories, Dallas was attracting Easterners to stay permanently in Dallas, But cities can't sit idly by and expect to stay competitive. They always have to be on the lookout for the next big industry that they could attract to further diversify their economy, provide more jobs, and bring in more people. By the early 1870s, it was clear that the next big thing would be rail. Trains were booming across the country, especially after the completion of the International Railroad in 1869. In 1871, the Houston and Central Texas Railroad was extending north from the Gulf to Corsicana, which was at the time a major city. Dallas knew the threat of being beat to the punch by a local neighbor. So the city raised funds and paid the new railway to alter its course east to Dallas, finally giving the city the rail line it craved and a clear leg up on its western neighbor. Suddenly, immigrants reaching the southern Ellis Island of Galveston could easily book a train north. This move was so successful that within a year of the rail line opening, Dallas's population more than doubled. While Dallas began resembling a diverse metropolis of the East, Fort Worth was seemingly becoming a stagnant frontier boomtown whose population would wither away whenever the cattle industry died out, as was proven by the panic in 1873. In 1875, the Dallas Herald published an article telling settlers to keep away from Fort Worth and settle in Dallas instead, noting that Dallas had far more economic opportunities, and that so little was going on in Fort Worth that a panther was seen sleeping on the courthouse steps. The battle for Fort Worth's survival was on, and the folks in Panther City, as they'd now adopted, weren't backing down. After some political backroom dealings down in Austin, State Representative A.F. Leonard and his colleagues secured the new Texas and Pacific Railway to come through Fort Worth, finally arriving in 1876. The new rail line, which extended from Shreveport, Louisiana to California, largely supplanted the Abilene, Kansas stockyards, now making Fort Worth stockyards the key destination for Texas cattle, rather than making the lengthy journey up to Kansas. Just as with Dallas's north-south rail, Fort Worth's east-west connection revitalized the city and led to an era of rapid growth. Fort Worth continued to invest in rail, becoming the regional hub for continental shipping that still exists today. Multiple shipping companies call Fort Worth home, most notably the Santa Fe Railway, which merged with the Burlington Northern in 1995, creating BNSF, which is still the country's largest train company. As America entered the Gilded Age, Dallas's attempted squashing of Fort Worth would not be forgotten. Like I said in my previous video, the rivalry was so extreme that when the two cities' baseball teams met for the first time in the 1880s, the game was cut short because the competition developed into a legitimate shootout. By the turn of the century, Dallas and Fort Worth were two of the largest cities in the state. Dallas reached the population of 92,000 in 1910 and officially became the state's second largest city, behind the historic San Antonio. Fort Worth sat in fourth with a population of 73,000. They would hold these places for the next 70 years as both of their populations continued to go up, especially with the further discoveries of Texas's next big thing, oil. Anyone who knows anything about Texas knows we've got oil, and lots of it. The discovery of black gold at Spindletop started an economic arms race of folks buying up land in hopes of striking it rich, ballooning the previously dirt-poor Texan economy and sparse population. Boomtowns started up overnight like Kilgore, Sweetwater, and Breckenridge. Just like the previous next big things, most of these towns blossomed into sprawling cities, teeming with new arrivals, just for everyone to move out as soon as the taps ran dry. No different than the deserted mining towns of California or trapping settlements of the frontier. And through it all remained Fort Worth and Dallas. Despite neither city sitting on any significant oil field, both gained tremendous riches, especially during the early booms of the 1910s and 20s. Naturally, each city's oil money closely resembled its unique culture. Eastern Dallas, resembling the business infrastructure of northern cities like New York or Boston, saw a rise in massive corporations and land companies, which bought profitable acreage, then turned around and sold them at higher prices to producers. These were often Yankee fellows from the financial sector who wanted to get in on the action, forming Goliaths to rake in ridiculous amounts of money, which they'd flaunt in growingly more obscene fashion, resembling the landed elite of the Northeast they were accustomed to. Across the river, Fort Worth looked west to Texas' vast panhandle. The Fort Worth economy was built off of large landowning families with a mistrust for outsiders. So naturally, Fort Worth's oil money was less flashy, as these ranchers didn't really give a hoot what anyone thought of them, rich or poor. But boy did they sure enjoy not being poor. Some of the largest Texan landowners who'd suddenly become practical Saudi princes were eager to immortalize themselves and enshrine their legacies. And in the 1920s, what better way was there to do this than with massive construction projects? But in the sparse emptiness of West Texas, there wasn't a major population center to become boosters of. So the families turned to the old cattle drive stockyards that marked the start of the West. Fort Worth. Due to this, Fort Worth's skyline started to grow with buildings that are still standing today, like the W.T. Wagner Building, the Farmers and Mechanics National Bank, and the Blackstone Hotel. As I said in my last video, in the 1920s, Fort Worth boasted the largest skyline west of the Mississippi, and was only 50,000 people away from being the largest city in the state. In other words, they were only a Boone Pickens Stadium away from being the largest city in the state. But Dallas wasn't going to take this lying down, as it was time for the next big thing, organized crime.
Hey, where's the freaking gabagoo?
As odd as it might sound today, organized crime played a major role in the development of American cities, especially in the 20s and 30s. We like to think of this concept as being confined to just a few places like Manhattan or Chicago, but it was much more common, especially if we're looking back with our modern sensibilities. Just about every city in the country revolved around bribes, glad-handing, and potentially threats of violence, and Fort Worth and Dallas were no different. With its already existing ties to the east, mobsters moved into Dallas as the racket up north started getting cracked down on. Dallas was seen as a gateway into the south, and some very interesting folks with ties to some of the most famous spaghetti-eating families set up roots down in D-Town. But that's a story for another video. What matters is that this further solidified the Dallas culture, especially its nightlife and underground persona, as reminiscent of what you'd find up in Brooklyn. These fellas tried their hand in expanding west into Fort Worth, but were run out every time. This wasn't to say that Fort Worth was squeaky clean, as the spirit of Hell's Half Acre was alive and well, now with Hell's Highway on what is today Jacksboro Highway running down to Lake Worth, even garnering Fort Worth the national nickname Little Chicago. But again, if I open that door, I'll be here for hours. These local club owners ran their own rackets outside ties to any of the larger organized cartels, keeping Fort Worth's criminal underworld distinctly different than those found over in Dallas. But this too would fade as the economy improved with direct involvement from FDR's government in the Great Depression. Texas got a lot of love during these programs as FDR's vice president was a Texas native, John Nance Garner, Cactus Jack. This is when the largest Texan megaproject took place, the construction of dozens of man-made lakes to tame the wild flood-prone rivers and provide some limited hydropower to the vast state. By the way, did you know that every one of Texas's lakes is man-made except for one? If you know what that one is, comment it below. Anyway, one of Garner's biggest boosters was someone who did so much not just for Fort Worth but for Texas as a whole that he really deserves his own video. The landman and newspaper magnate Amon G. Carter. The owner of the Star-Telegram's admiration for Fort Worth and disdain for Dallas is legendary. From the quick one-liners to his borderline insufferable love for his adopted hometown, he was truly one of a kind. I could talk about him for hours, but this script is already getting up there in length, so we're going to keep it to just one story, which is something I already touched on in my last video, the Centennial Exhibition. To catch everyone up, the Centennial Exhibition was a World Fair-like event to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of Texan independence from Mexico. 4 cities made the final cut: San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth, and Dallas. All signs were pointing to it being held in San Antonio for, well, obvious reasons, as it was the cultural heart of the state, the home of the Alamo, and so on. When suddenly, Dallas was announced as the host city. Rumors and legends have continued to persist about just how Dallas bribed their way to get there, but we'll likely never know the real reason. Anyway, Dallas ended up putting on a hell of a show and building a wonderful exhibit. So wonderful, in fact, that the organizers decided to host a fair at the same spot every year, eventually becoming the Texas State Fair. You can go see the fairgrounds today and see the beautiful 1930s Art Deco architecture and murals alongside its crown jewel, the Cotton Bowl. Over in Fort Worth, Amon Carter was furious, reportedly shouting "goddamn" in his office so many times that his aides, who were used to Amon's sailor tongue, were concerned. When he emerged, he put together a plan to steal away Dallas's limelight by constructing a fair of his own. The Frontier Exhibition, as it was called, was constructed and ran the same time as the Centennial over in Dallas. Fort Worth had more acreage, more museums, and the nationally famous Casa Manana, which inspired the creation of new theaters from California to New York. Carter's Fair was a hit as well, and after its run, the land became what is now Fort Worth's cultural district, including Will Rogers, Farrington Field, and the Kimball Art Museum. The end of the Depression and the start of the war changed a lot in America, as we emerged the strongest country in the world, and people started to move out from the cities and into suburbs. Rail lines which once crisscrossed each city were ripped up and replaced with highways. In Fort Worth, you can still see the remnants of what was once trolley lines in the roads with large center medians where the streetcars once ran. During the war, Amon Carter petitioned the United States to build an airplane manufacturing hub in the city, which was the largest in the country, eventually becoming what is Lockheed Martin today. This marked the start of Fort Worth's close ties to aviation, followed by a local company, American Airlines, becoming one of the largest in the world. Meanwhile, Dallas continued down the path of finance and telecommunications, becoming the home of AT&T, Texas Instruments, and Tenet Healthcare. In the 1970s, the next big thing was major regional airports, and the two battled over who would get it. A compromise was reached when the airport was called Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, and placed in both counties, though the majority of it was actually in Fort Worth's Tarrant County. And the southern exit was within her city limits, so meaning that anyone leaving from the southern part of the airport had to pass through Fort Worth before getting anywhere else. Alongside this, the airport's biggest partner, American Airlines, was a Fort Worth-based company. Unsatisfied with the deal, Dallas's own Southwest Airlines packed up their toys and moved out east, determined to start their own airport to challenge DFW. And anyone who's flown into the tiny Love Field can tell you just how well that went.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Now, the two cities have entered the 21st century and continue to climb up the charts of the largest cities in the country, with Dallas at 9th place with 1.3 million people, and Fort Worth at 12th place with 978,000. Some projections have Fort Worth surpassing Dallas in as little as 20 years, while most agree that the metroplex will be the largest metro area in the country by the end of the century, which is really what compelled me to make this video. With so many people moving in, I think it's important to get the history of the region out there, so it's not lost to time. Our quirks are really what define us, and I really hate for either city to lose what makes us unique. Thanks to popular media like the TV show Dallas and sports teams like the Dallas Mavs or Dallas Cowboys, outsiders have almost universally labeled the entire region as just Dallas. But anyone who's actually been here before knows that couldn't be further from the truth. I don't know, but maybe we should split the DFW Metroplex into the Dallas Metroplex and the Fort Worth Metroplex, because each city's suburbs feel uniquely tied to that city's cultures, especially when you go east of Dallas or west of Fort Worth. Like, you can't tell me that Azle or Weatherford are anything like Rockwall or Rowlett. And as for my hometown, I've seen plenty of folks say that we shouldn't be happy about all this, and that Fort Worth is losing who it was by not being a small town anymore. But we've never been a small town. Since the development of the settlement into a city, it's continuously been one of the largest cities in the state. So that small town feel that folks are talking about isn't the number of people, it's the mentality that runs all the way back to the days when the Panthers still slept in the courthouse steps. So we should be happy about this growth, because when we can look at the results of population decline like the cities in California or the Rust Belt cities, we need to learn to appreciate the opportunity that we have, and not repeat the same mistakes of those that came before. I'm looking at you, high-speed rail. Let's get this baby built so we can get these cars off the road. And now, for my favorite part of the video, my completely honest and unbiased comparison of the two cities to settle once and for all, who's better, Dallas or Fort Worth? Okay, I've divided this into three categories: travel, cost, and activities, each with three subcategories, and judged purely off of vibes, with me counting everything Tarrant County as Fort Worth and everything Dallas County as Dallas, so don't sue me. I know there's a hell of a lot more that goes into making these decisions, like politics, school districts, and crime, but that's so opinionated, I'm not even going to touch it. Well, besides saying that Dallas has a kill count for presidents, Fort Worth doesn't. Okay, here we go! First, roads. Contrary to public belief, both cities have arguably pretty good roads. It's just that folks compare it to some mythical idea of perfect roads. Think our roads are shit? Drive across the border in Louisiana. So this category is really talking about traffic. As for that, Fort Worth wins out, especially with Dallas's national fame for horrible car wrecks, and the potential for seeing an SMU alumni fleeing the scene after causing a pileup. Fort Worth is even starting to put up protected bike lanes. Point for Fort Worth. Next, rail. This might be surprising, but Fort Worth is the largest rail user in Texas. Point for Fort Worth. Finally, airports. This one's easy, as there's three major airports in the Metroplex: Love, DFW, and Meacham. Two of these are located in Fort Worth, and one of them, DFW, is one of the largest airports in the continent, with regular flights all over the world. Some folks say DFW's hard to get around, but it's got an easy-to-use SkyRail, and terminals are just circles within circles, so if you miss an exit, you just keep going and you come back to it. Point for the Fort. First, restaurants. Dallas is home to some really famous restaurants with famously ridiculous prices. Fort Worth has its fair share of pricey joints too, but if you're one of those guys that just has to spend $300 on a dinner to impress your date, then Dallas is the spot for you. Fort Worth's food is mostly barbecue, Mexican, and Southern comfort, while Dallas is more exotic, where you can find anything from Thai to Greek. So if we're judging based off the diversity of options, Dallas has it. Point for Dallas. Rent. Again, this one's pretty easy because a report just came out a few weeks ago about this. The average rent in Dallas is $1,500, while the average rent in Fort Worth is $1,200, about 80%. Not to mention your paycheck will get you a lot further in Panther City than D-Town. Point for the Fort. Finally, gas. It might seem silly for me to put gas in its own category here, but this is really representing the cost of necessities in general in the two cities, as everything is really tied to the price of gas. And what do we find here? Prices are regularly cheaper over in Fort Worth than Dallas, typically mirroring Fort Worth's rent being 80% the cost of Dallas's. This doesn't mean that it's universal though, as you can find some cheaper rents in Dallas suburbs than you could find in Fort Worth's downtown. Nevertheless, necessities are almost universally cheaper in Fort Worth than Dallas. Point for the Fort. Finally, what everyone came here for. What the hell is there to do? First, arts. Surprisingly, despite Dallas's proclivity for everything snobby, their art scene is quite small. That isn't to say it's non-existent, but it's much more show than substance. The massive music hall at Fair Park is the Metroplex's main theater for major traveling Broadway shows in their first runs. But other than this and a few others, their local theater scene is remote. Meanwhile, Fort Worth's Bass Hall, Casa Manana, and others regularly hold new and touring productions with significant talent. Definitely worth it for a fun night out. Dallas's museums aren't much better, as Fort Worth's Kimball, Amon G. Carter, and Calgary Museum blow them all away. Not to mention that Fort Worth is soon to be the home of the National Juneteenth Museum. Point for the fort. Texans love their sports, and DFW is no different. The Metroplex is home to all 5 major professional sports, with 2 of them being located in Fort Worth, Tarrant County, and the rest being in Dallas. Each city has its own college sports team, which, if you didn't know, how did you find this video? Please tell me, I'm curious. Genuinely, I'm curious. Dallas is also home to the Cotton Bowl, which is currently undergoing massive renovations. Over in Fort Worth, the recently built Dickies Arena hosts the Panther City lacrosse team and the historic Fort Worth Rodeo. This one's tough, but I'll just do it based off of who has more professional sports teams, and Dallas beats Fort Worth 3-2. Point for Dallas. Finally, the catch-all. As for everything else that there is to do in the Metroplex, I'm going to stay clear of talking about the bar scenes, because I think that they're both got their own gimmicks to offer. Dallas is home to the big city feel clubs where you have to pay a hefty fee to get in. Fort Worth is more centered around live music and smaller bars. Something I will weigh in on is the lakes, as boating is a major part of the local culture, especially during summertime. Fort Worth can thank Amon Carter and Vice President Garner, as it's home to some of the Metroplex's largest lakes, like Grapevine, Eagle Mountain, and Lake Worth. In the west of Dallas is Lake Ray Hubbard, but that's really all they got offering. Fort Worth is also home to the area's biggest amusement park, Six Flags, which is the original Six Flags, by the way. Other tourist attractions in the 2 cities are the Stockyards in Fort Worth and Dealey Plaza in Dallas. Fort Worth's Botanical Garden also beats out anything compared to over in Dallas, but Dallas does have a kick-ass aquarium. As for the zoos, the Fort Worth Zoo is regularly voted one of the best in the country, while Dallas seems to have a problem keeping people from stealing their animals. All this is just scratching the surface, so don't you ever tell me that you got nothing to do in DFW. Point for Fort Worth. Finally, with the clear majority, it is finally settled for here and ever after that Fort Worth is superior to Dallas. Don't believe me? Well, comment below and let me know what you think. To sum it up, the big difference as I see it is that Dallas, the New York of the South, feels distinctly Eastern compared to where the West begins, Fort Worth. Fort Worth, you'll still see people wearing cowboy hats non-ironically. In Dallas, back in the 60s and 70s, businesses collectively got together and said we were not going to allow boots, cowboy hats, bowline ties, anything Western, because they're trying to move away from that Western feel. Whereas Fort Worth is embracing it, literally having the slogan, "Experience the Modern West." Obviously, I know my bias is towards Fort Worth because that's where I've grown up and that's a city that I personally like more. But there's a lot of fun stuff to do in Dallas, absolutely, and there's things in Dallas I wish Fort Worth had. Like I wish Fort Worth had the really cool farmers market that Dallas does, or the old retro trolley cars in the streets like Dallas does. So it really depends on your preference. Dallas is all about the big flash, big showiness, the buildings are bigger, the downtown's bigger. Fort Worth is more quiet, more quaint. So if that's one that you want or don't want, that's really going to decide what it is that you think is the better city. There's still plenty of stories to tell, and still stories being told right now. Seeing as I was writing this, the Dallas City Council voted unanimously to postpone the high-speed rail project to connect Fort Worth and Dallas, with council members saying in the meeting that they were worried that the project would further help Fort Worth take away their business and people. It's just like the 1870s all over again. In response, Fort Worth Mayor Matty Parker released a statement and did the Thanos meme.
Fine. I'll do it myself.
So time will tell what the next big thing will bring. Until then, I'll catch you on the next one.